So I think I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. Okay, so my name is Shreya and I am the TA for AP Microeconomics, and today we're going to be doing a brief review of Unit 1, and then afterwards we'll have a Q&A session where you can ask questions about Units 1 and 2. And you can follow us or find us at ThinkFiveable on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And we also have a TikTok, so check that out. And I just went over what that was, so a brief review of Unit 1 and then a Q&A for both Units 1 and 2, if your teacher has reached Unit 2, of course. Okay, so first I guess we'll start with the scarcity. So economics is centered around scarcity. Economics is basically the study of how we allocate resources in a society. And scarcity is basically when we have unlimited wants, but we have limited resources. And this leads us to make decisions and have trade-offs. So trade-offs are like the things that we're giving up. So if I wanted to buy, I guess, a Toyota, and I was also considering getting like a Honda or an Audi, those other two cars would be my trade-offs. And the opportunity cost is your highest valued trade-off. Sorry, just letting people in from the waiting room. So as I was saying, the opportunity cost is your highest valued trade-off. So if I didn't get that Toyota, my next choice would have been a Honda. So that Honda is my opportunity cost. And with scarcity comes the factors of production, which kind of like ties into it. So the 4 factors of production are land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. So capital either refers to human capital, which is like training or education, or physical capital, which is like tools and machinery. So I guess if we were looking at like a pizza shop, the land would be like the flour, the tomatoes, the cheese, like all of the ingredients, and then the labor would be the actual people that make the pizzas. The capital, the human capital, would be all the training people get to make the pizzas, and the physical capital would be things that like mix dough or like the pizza ovens, and the entrepreneurship would refer to the person that started the business. And yes, Kurt, building more colleges in a society would increase human capital. That's a good point. And since I'm just like briefly reviewing things, let me know if I should slow down anywhere and like go over things more in depth. I just kind of want to get to the Q&A so you guys can get questions answered. So our 3 basic economic questions that we have to answer in a society to know how to allocate resources are what goods and services to produce, how to produce those goods and services, and who consumes these goods and services. And these are the 4 major economic systems, and they are all different because of how they handle resource allocation, which you will see in this chart. So there are like 4 main market structures. You mainly need to know command, free market, and mixed, but I also included traditional because it's good to know. So in a traditional market structure, it's kind of like focused on preserving customs and culture. It's more found in second or third world countries or more like isolated areas of the world, and surplus usually isn't the main goal. It's more about selling items that are unique to their culture and just like making a bare living off of it. And a command market structure is very strict in terms of resource allocation. So the government, or sometimes in like the AP exam, you'll hear them be called like central planners. So these central planners control the economy. So they have control over all of the factors of production. So land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. But an advantage of it is that quick decisions can be made and executed. Since the government has control over everything, they can like take one action and then it applies to everyone in that area. But a disadvantage is that society's needs are not met, which can lead to the formation of an illegal black market to get those goods and services that are needed and not satisfied by the government's economy. So free market is on the exact opposite side of that scale. Government has a limited role or no role in this economy at all. Innovation is rewarded here, so you'll see a lot of like competition between different producers to create like better and cheaper items. And supply and demand runs the market. So when there's increased demand for a good, producers using their own like self-interest, they will meet the demand for that good and supply more of it. However, one main disadvantage of a free market is that inequality can happen because um, there are these things called like public goods. That's a Unit 6 topic, but like education and like public transportation, like some people may not provide that. So like some producers may not be able to provide that because there's not that much benefit that comes with those kinds of goods. And that leads to people who are making lower incomes not having like access to the goods that they need. So the economy could be producing like private jets while like 20% of the population could be in poverty. So that's the main disadvantage of a free market. And lastly, there's a mixed economy, and this has characteristics of, that's supposed to say a free market, but a free market and command economies. But the government can still like step in to regulate monopolies and market failures, but there is still like private property ownership. So for a command economy, a good example would be China. For a free market, a good example would be New Zealand. And for a mixed economy, the United States. Okay, so this is the production possibilities curve, and it kind of shows you how, like, what combination of two goods that you can produce with a certain amount of resources. So there's three types of these curves that you will probably see. So the first one is an increasing opportunity cost curve. So that means I'm just going to use the axes that they give you here. As you increase the production of butter by like 1 unit, the opportunity cost increases, because if you're going from A to B, you're only giving up a few of the second good, but when you're going from B to C, you're giving up more and more of that good. Now, constant opportunity costs, it's a straight line, and it usually means that the two goods that are produced on the axes are like really close substitutes in terms of what resources that they need. So an example of this would be like pizza and calzones. They need the same exact ingredients, so the opportunity cost would stay the same each time you want to produce more of one. And decreasing opportunity cost, you'll probably not see this on the exam, but it's usually used when two goods aren't produced with very similar resources. So as you keep producing more and more of butter, the opportunity cost of producing butter starts decreasing eventually. And there are some shifters of the production possibilities curve. So one of them could be like more or better resources. So just use butter again. So if there are better dairy cows being bred, then the curve can move outwards like this, but obviously this other good would not be affected. However, if you were talking about like pizzas and calzones and the production of cheese increased, then the whole curve could shift out. And that kind of like ties into technological advancements. So if the production of butter like got like a lot better, the PPC would like shift out on that side. And lastly, economic growth or shrinkage. So when the economy grows, the entire PPC shifts outward, but when it shrinks, so when there's like a recession, it can like completely move inwards. And any point inside the production possibilities curve is actually inefficient, and it can represent unemployment. And then any curve outside that's not on the line is kind of like unattainable. So you can like reach it for a short amount of time, but you can't sustain that level of production. Okay, so this is absolute advantage. So absolute advantage is basically whoever can produce the good or service most efficiently. So the first type of absolute advantage problems you will see are input problems. So that's referring to like what resources or labor that's needed to go into the production of the good. So for absolute advantage problems that are asking about input, so this one says labor hours right here, you are looking for the entity or the country that can produce each good for the least amount of time or resources. So in this case, if we start looking at cheese, England can produce 1 unit of cheese with 1 labor hour, and Spain can produce 1 unit of cheese with 2 labor hours. So obviously England is going to have the absolute advantage of that because it takes a shorter time. And the same with bread. England only takes 2 hours to produce 1 unit of bread, and Spain takes 8. So England has the absolute advantage in both cases. And there's also output problems involving absolute advantage. So in this case, you're looking for the entity or the country that can produce the most amount of a good or service. So in this case, England can produce 40 units of cheese in 40 hours, while Spain can only produce 20 units of cheese. So England has the absolute advantage, and same with bread. Now, there is also comparative advantage, which refers to whoever can produce the good or service with the least opportunity cost. So in this case, there's also input and output problems. So for input, the general rule is that the other goes under. I just remember the acronym IOU. And what I mean by that is, I'll just show you guys the fractions, but if we're looking at England's production of cheese, that means to find the opportunity cost of 1 unit of cheese, we just take the amount of bread that they can produce and just put it as the denominator. So as you can see, I did that here. So 1 unit of cheese has an opportunity cost of a ½ unit of bread. And the same applies to all of the other boxes. So for England's production of bread, 1 unit of bread has an opportunity cost of 2 units of cheese. And the same with the other ones. So now we just need to look at which one has the least opportunity cost. And we go by columns usually to find the one that has the least opportunity cost. But like when you write out the equations like this, it usually helps you understand it better. But Spain only has to give up 1/4 of a unit of bread to produce 1 unit of cheese, so it has the comparative advantage for cheese, and England only gives up 2 units of cheese as compared to 4 to produce 1 unit of bread, so England has the comparative advantage for bread. Now for output problems, it's the exact opposite, so you put the thing in the box like right above it, so you use it as the numerator instead. So if we're looking at Spain's production of cheese, you would do 5 and then you would put it over 20. So you get that 1 unit of cheese has an opportunity cost of 1/4 of a unit of bread. And then for Spain's production of bread, 1 unit of bread has an opportunity cost of 20 over 5, which is 4 units of cheese. And again, we're just looking for the one with the least opportunity cost, and that would be Spain with cheese and England with bread again. And terms of trade are the conditions upon which two entities decide to trade. So you'll probably be asked this in like an FRQ more likely, but when you write out equations like this, it becomes pretty helpful. So basically what you do is find a number between these two coefficients, I guess. So I'm just going to look at input for now. So right now we have 1b equals 2c and 1b equals 4c. So a number between 2 and 4 would be 3. That's like the easiest one to go with. So the best terms of trade would probably be trading 1 unit of bread. So England would trade off 1 unit of bread and Spain would give them 3 units of cheese. And you can also do this with this column as well. So you could do 1 unit of cheese equals 1/3 of a unit of bread. So this is cost-benefit analysis. So first I'll explain the difference between implicit and explicit costs. So implicit costs are more about what you're giving up. So if you quit your job that paid $20,000 a year to open up your own side business, your implicit cost of that decision would be $20,000 because that's kind of what you're giving up in exchange for something else. And explicit costs are the direct upfront costs. So when you're opening that business, you have to pay $1,000 for rent and then $500 for employees. So your explicit costs would be $1,500 because that's what you're actually paying upfront. And those are direct costs. And there are some terms that you'll see all around AP Micro. So marginal means additional. So every time you're increasing by a unit, that's the difference between the two numbers. And utility is referring to satisfaction. Utility is also kind of interchangeable with benefits. So marginal benefits could also be called marginal utility. And the general rule for cost-benefit analysis, when you're given a chart that has marginal costs and marginal benefits, is MB equals MC. So marginal benefits equals marginal costs. So let's take a look at this table real quick. So for the most part, College Board will probably give you just the total revenue. So you'll have to calculate the marginal benefit by yourself. So basically what you do to get marginal benefit is you do whatever benefit you got from the unit that you're on and then subtract whatever came before it. So for 1 hour that this business remains open, you would do 25 minus 0, so its marginal benefit is 25. And then going from 1 to 2, the marginal benefit is 20. And then from 2 to 3, it's 15. So you can see I'm just subtracting. It's the additional benefit that you get. And marginal cost is just 10 in this case. So you want marginal benefits to equal marginal costs because that's just where your total benefit is maximized, and that's where you get the most use out of your resources or money. And in this case, that would be remaining at 4 hours open. If you decided to open for any longer period of time, you can see that the cost becomes greater than the benefit, and it's just a principle of economics. You don't want your cost to be greater than what you're actually getting in return, because you're technically making a loss then. And lastly, there's marginal analysis using the utility maximizing rule. So that basically says that the marginal utility of good X divided by the price of good X has to be equal to the marginal utility of good Y divided by the price of good Y. And the law of diminishing marginal utility says that as you consume more and more of any good or service, the additional satisfaction you get eventually decreases. So I will show you an example of one. And these tables are also on the Unit 1 study guide for AP Micro that Fiveable has, so check those out. But College Board will probably give you just the total utility column and again make you calculate marginal utility. So that's just how we did it last time. You would do 12 minus 0, 20 minus 12, 26 minus 20, and so on. And the first step is to look at the marginal utility per dollar. So once you solve for marginal utility, you have to divide that by the price. So in this case, the price of hamburgers is $2. So we have all of our marginal utilities. So we make another column, divide all of them by 2. And then we do the same with soft pretzels, except with $3. So after we finish all of our calculations, first we would buy whichever good has the greater marginal utility divided by price. And in this case, that's one soft pretzel because the mu over p of one soft pretzel is $8. And the next thing that we would do is buy 1 unit of hamburgers and an additional unit of soft pretzels because the mu over p is 6 for both of them. And it's also important to keep track of your total budget. So I think I forgot to add this, but the total budget was 24, I believe. So when you buy one soft pretzel in the first step, you would be down to $21. And then after you buy one hamburger and one soft pretzel, you would be down to 16. And then you keep going. So you buy a second hamburger and a third soft pretzel and a third hamburger and a fourth soft pretzel. And those are your the final combination of goods that would satisfy utility maximization. Okay, so it's time for a Q&A. So do you guys have any questions, any upcoming tests, anything you want me to go over? Oh, and also, I'm just curious, what unit are you guys on? If you're self-studying, what unit have you made it to? Or if you're taking it in class, where have you gone up to? And you can unmute yourself if you want, or just say it in the chat.
Can you talk more about cost-benefit analysis?
Yeah, I can do that. Okay, so is there any specific part that you want me to go over more? Or
What is utility on this chart?
oh yeah, so utility and benefit, they kind of mean the same thing. In this case, you'll most likely see marginal benefit and marginal cost coupled together on a table, but you can also just see marginal utility and marginal cost. So in this case, the marginal cost would be $2 because the price of the good is $2. So that's essentially what it's saying. But yeah, I think benefit doesn't have to be monetary necessarily. I think that's a main difference between utility and benefit because you'll most likely see utility as a dollar amount and benefit as just benefit. But in this case, I guess total revenue and total benefit are interchangeable on this table. Okay, great. Any other questions? We still have about like 30 minutes, so
Can you talk some about Unit 2?
yeah, I can do that. Um, Let me just stop sharing real quick. Oh, I'm so sorry. The chat wasn't opening up for me. I just missed some questions. So, okay. Decreasing opportunity cost. You probably won't see it. I just included it so you know that the graph looks bowed in, but the resources, they have the exact opposite relationship of increasing opportunity costs. So whatever um, good is on the x-axis, as you keep increasing the production of the good on the x-axis, the opportunity cost actually decreases. So it gets like, it becomes more efficient to produce good X. I think that's a better way to say that. And okay, and you guys are both like pretty good with Unit 1 then. I'll just open up like a virtual whiteboard and start writing on this then. Okay, so I think I'll like start with demand. So demand is basically the different quantities of goods that people are willing and able to buy at different quantities. Okay, that's fine. Thank you for coming. Okay, and then, so demand is a downward sloping thing. So that's kind of how it looks. That's the demand curve. And this is our price, and this is our quantity. So there are a few reasons that it is downward sloping. And this is actually called the law of demand. So it basically says that price and quantity are inversely related. So the um, demand curve is downward sloping because of three things. So the first thing is the substitution effect. So if the price of a good increases, then the consumer will buy less of that product and instead buy more of a substitute product. So if the price of peanut butter increased, a consumer would buy, like, demand less quantity of it and then demand more of almond butter. Another thing is the income effect. So if the price decreases for a product, the purchasing power for a consumer increases. So that purchasing power is just referring to how much of a good a consumer can buy with a set income. So if the price of pizzas decreased, I could buy more and therefore I could demand more, like a greater quantity demanded, I mean. It's important to not get quantity demanded mixed up with demand because changes in price do not shift, I don't know what that was, they do not shift the demand curve. And I will get into that when we talk about shifters. And then the last thing that makes the demand curve downward sloping is the law of diminishing marginal utility. So as you consume like more and more of a quantity of a certain good, the additional satisfaction that you receive from that good will eventually decrease. So those are the three reasons why it's downward sloping. So I guess I'll talk about why, or like the shifters of the demand curve now. So the first shifter of the demand curve is complementary and the prices of like related goods. So that's complementary goods and substitute goods. So again, substitute goods, as I mentioned before, are goods that you could use to like replace a certain good. They're kind of like interchangeable. And a complementary good is a good that goes like together with another good. So like hot dogs and hot dog buns, or hamburgers and ketchup, or something like that. So if the price of peanut butter increased, then the demand for almond butter would also increase. So that would be something that would actually cause a demand shift to the right. But if the price of hot dog buns increased, then the demand for actual sausages would decrease. So that would cause a leftward shift. And the next shifter of demand is tastes and preferences. So that's like what the
So,
consumer. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
so with like complimentary, could you say like complimentary is peanut butter and jelly, but substitute is peanut butter or almond butter?
Yeah, you could say that. Okay, so tastes and preferences just refers to what the consumers want. So if there's like some kind of commercial that comes out that that talks about how like dairy milk has a bunch of hormones in it, the demand for almond milk might increase, which would cause a rightward shift in demand. Another shifter of demand is the number of consumers. So if a large number of consumers suddenly move into a small town, then the demand for a good produced by some business in that town would increase because they have a greater market to sell their good to. Another one is future expectations of price. So if a consumer expects a price to increase in the future, then their demand will go up for the time being because they want to buy it before the price increases. And then it might go down if they know that the price will decrease in the future. So, like right before Black Friday, like the few weeks before it, like before holiday sales even start, the demand for electronics probably goes down because they know that if they wait just a few more weeks, the prices will go down. So they'll wait until then. And lastly, we have income. So there's two types of goods that can be bought with income. So there's normal goods. So these are more like luxury goods or new goods. So like a purse or seafood, any kind of like new item. But an inferior good is something that's generally more cheap and like refers to like used goods more. So like thrift store clothing, ramen, a used car, like things like that. So they actually have like unique relationships to demand. So if my income increased and we were talking about the demand for, I don't know, diamonds, my demand would probably increase if my income increased a lot because diamonds are a normal good. But if my income decreased, my demand would decrease. But if we were talking about used clothing, which is an inferior good, and my income increased, then my demand would actually decrease for used clothing because why would I buy used clothing if I could buy new clothing with my increased income? And then same works the other way around. So those are the five main shifters of demand. I guess I'll move on to supply then.
That would be nice.
Okay, so supply is actually upward sloping. So it follows the law of supply, which says that price and quantity have a positive relationship when you're talking about supply. So when you have a higher price firms are willing to supply a higher quantity because more profits. It's kind of like what economics is about. And there are some shifters of supply as well. I would say that there's five. Some teachers might like consolidate them into four, but I just split them up. So the first one is the prices or availability of inputs or resources. So if we were talking about leather handbags and suddenly the government or just the price of leather like goes up a lot, then supply would decrease. Or if leather got cheaper, supply would increase and the whole supply curve would shift right. And the next one is the number of sellers. It's just like when there's more producers, there's more total supply of a good. If there's less producers in a market, there's less total supply of a good. And the next one would be technology. So if we were talking about the production of bread in a factory, if the new machines in that bread factory could produce 10 loaves of bread instead of one loaf of bread per minute, obviously supply would increase and then shift right. And then there's another one, there's government actions, which could be taxes or subsidies. So if the government, if we were talking about handbags again, and the government placed a tax on like cows because they were concerned about too many cows being used for leather, supply would decrease because the firm would have to pay more because they have to pay the additional price of a tax. And lastly, there's expectations of future profit. So if a firm predicts that they could make more profit later, they'll probably decrease supply. They'll actually increase supply, excuse me. So if they foresee that profit could be made soon, they will increase supply of their good. And I talked about taxes and subsidies, but I didn't say what a subsidy was. So a subsidy is just like a government payment that like supports a business and it causes supply to increase, like for the most part. And yeah, I think that's about it for supply. I guess I could move on to consumer and producer surplus since we have a little more time. Oh, and I think I forgot to mention before, but if we're talking about like an increase in or decrease in price, that does not shift the supply or demand curve. It's really important to remember that. A change in price only affects the quantity supplied or the quantity demanded. Okay, so consumer surplus is basically what a consumer gains from a purchase. So it's what they're willing to pay minus the actual market price. So just looking at this graph, the equilibrium market price would be, I don't know, let's say $5, and the equilibrium quantity would be 10. So this line right here kind of is where the consumer and producer surplus gets divided. So consumer surplus is basically everything above that line, and then producer surplus is everything below that line. And producer surplus is the market price that the firm is able to sell it for minus the lowest price that they're willing to sell it for. So one firm might be willing to sell it for $1, so and they actually get to sell it for 5 because that's the market price. So their producer surplus would be 4. But another producer, sorry, might be able to only offer it for $4 and they would sell it at 5. So their producer surplus would be 1. And then the same thing goes for consumer surplus. Someone might be willing to buy the good for $10, but they actually get it for a market price of 5. So that would be their consumer surplus. And when you're asked to find like consumer and producer surplus, like on a graph, like the total consumer and producer surplus, you would basically just use like the area of a triangle formula. So you would do half times base times height, and then same with producer surplus. Okay.
So
Um,
consumer surplus is when like they're willing to pay more but they don't, and producer surplus is when they pay more than they were willing to.
yeah, essentially. So like the total producer surplus in a market is just everything that people are willing, firms are willing and able to sell a good for up to the equilibrium price. So that's why it goes up to the equilibrium point right here. And then consumer surplus is everything, all the prices that consumers are willing and able to sell a good for up to the equilibrium price. Sorry, buy a good for. I'm mixing up my words, but the reason it only like it stops right here is because if a consumer was willing to buy it for $4 and they didn't want to buy it for 5, they can't really do that because everyone else up here is willing to pay a higher price. So suppliers are only going to supply for these people, and this person who's only willing to pay 4 is not going to get the good. And same thing with the producers. If a producer is only willing to sell it for $6, the consumers aren't going to buy from them because they could get it at $5 from any of the other producers. And the kind of like definition of consumer and producer surplus is a little bit like vague, I guess, but you won't really be asked to define it on an FRQ, which is good. You mostly just need to know how to apply it. Okay, so I think I'm gonna move on to price ceilings and price floors. Okay, so um, there are two types of price controls that a government can use, and those are price ceilings and price floors. And what's a little bit confusing about them is that price ceilings go down here. So this is where a price ceiling would go on a market graph, and then this is where a price floor would go. And I'm very sorry for the messy graphs.
It's fine. They still make sense.
Okay, and okay, wait, I think I forgot to mention this when I was talking about supply and demand, so I'll do this real fast. But it's a surplus versus a shortage. Um, so basically everything above here is a surplus because um, at all of these prices above equilibrium, the quantity supplied is out here and the quantity demanded is over here. So when quantity supplied is greater than quantity demanded, there is a surplus. So there's extra goods or services being produced. And the exact opposite is down here. So this whole area is shortage because the quantity demanded is greater than the quantity supplied. So now price floors and price ceilings might make more sense. So a price ceiling causes a shortage. So um, I'll just apply this to an example. So the best example I could think of is rent control. So if you were in like New York City, you'll probably experience rent control because the government wants to prevent landlords from charging rent prices that are way too high because like New York is a very like high demand for housing kind of city. So the government has to place some kind of control over the rent. that landlords can charge so that people can actually afford to live in the city. And the government can place a price control at right here. So that would a rent control would actually be considered a price ceiling because they're setting a lower than equilibrium price for an apartment. So this would cause a shortage because at this point you can see that quantity demanded is all the way out here and quantity supplied is out here. So if this was 5 or 10 and then 15 and 5, there would be a shortage of 5 or sorry 10 apartments because you would do 15 minus 5. On the other hand, a price floor causes a surplus. So a price floor can be used when I would probably think more like agriculture, like the government wants farmers to be able to make more money from their crops so that they can keep practicing agriculture. So market price and quantity is here, and usually they mark this as PE and Q sub E on like the AP exam. But a price floor like would make sure that the farmers are getting a higher than equilibrium quantity price then so that they can like gain more surplus. And this would actually cause a market surplus because the amount that's supplied is right here and the quantity that is demanded is down here. So when there's a greater supply than demand, that leads to a surplus. And
A
oh
price
yeah, go ahead.
will cause people to want to buy less of something because they were paying less before, but now they're being told that they have to pay this much or more.
Yes, and um, just like make sure you say that demand doesn't shift as long as you say that a price floor would cause people to decrease the quantity demanded, not just demand, then it would be like correct. So as long as you mention quantity demanded, like you're good. And like mention that there would be a surplus because QS is greater than QD.
Okay, and how do like government taxes and subsidies fit into that? Price floors and price ceilings.
So taxes and subsidies are separate from price floors and price ceilings. I think they come like a little bit later in Unit 2. I'm not sure like what the exact topic is, but I can do that next if you want.
Sure, I'm self-studying, so I'm learning this on my own. So I've kind of like read a little bit of everything from Unit 2, but not a lot of everything.
Yeah. Okay, wait, let me see if there's anything left in. Okay, so there is a little bit left in price floors and price ceilings that I want to go over real quick.
Sure.
Okay, so normally our consumer surplus would be here and our producer surplus would be here in a normal market. But if we're looking at a market that has a price, let's do price ceiling. And for a price floor to be binding, it has to be above equilibrium price, and for a price ceiling to be binding, it has to be below equilibrium price. And that's like another thing that you'll see on like the FRQs a lot. It'll say like binding. That just means effective. So when there's a price ceiling, what happens is that there is something called deadweight loss. And that is represented by this area right here that is colored in black. So that's deadweight loss. And that just means that this is the consumer and producer surplus that you're like missing out on because you imposed a price ceiling. And um, the consumer surplus becomes this area right here, and this tiny little triangle becomes producer surplus because um, producers would have gained all of this like right above here, but now that the price is like mandatory and it's like lowered, their producer surplus decreases. And obviously, when there's deadweight loss in a market, that just means that there's inefficiency because consumers and producers are missing out on surplus that they could have had. And the same thing basically applies to price floors. I'll just draw that graph. So it's here.
I think I get how it works. You don't have to draw it.
Okay, cool.
If you want to.
Okay, there's 9 more minutes of this. So let me see. I'll just like look and see if there's anything that I can cover quickly. Okay, so I guess we can do excise taxes next because you were asking about taxes. So let's say we were talking about producing cigarettes, and an excise tax is basically a per unit tax on producers. So for each unit that they produce, they have to pay a tax on each of those. And usually excise taxes are placed on goods like cigarettes or like any other products that the government doesn't want the society or like economy to produce. So let's say the government imposed a $2 per unit tax or excise tax on this cigarette market. That would cause supply to change here and it would shift left.
So would that be like just an extra sales tax kind of thing when you go buy it?
Yes, I will get into tax incidents and I think that'll explain it more.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so now I'm just going to draw all my dashed lines. This really helps like with producer, consumer surplus, all of that stuff. So again, this triangle right here would be deadweight loss because usually like this is our equilibrium price and this is our equilibrium quantity. So that's where consumer and producer surplus are like maximized. But since the supply gets shifted left because of a tax, obviously firms want to produce less when they're being charged more. Now there's deadweight loss in the market. And consumer surplus is now this little triangle right here. And producer surplus um, is this little part here. And that rectangle in the middle, this is so hard to do without colors, but this rectangle is the government revenue. So that's getting a little messy. I'll just draw a mini one off to the side. So when supply shifts left because of an excise tax, the vertical distance is the value of the tax. So looking at this, this would be $2 because we talked about putting a $2 tax on it. So this is the new quantity that you would do after the tax. So now the government's total revenue, if you were asked to calculate it, would be the value of the tax, or just, yeah, it would be the value of the tax. So that would be $2 multiplied by the quantity that is produced after the tax. And consumer surplus and producer surplus, they both decrease because they both bear the impact of the tax. And that relates to tax incidence. So for this, I use a acronym. I use EPIC. So actually, I haven't talked about elasticity yet, so this would make absolutely no sense. I won't go into tax incidence yet. I'll just go into like more about how to identify different graph values with an excise tax. So again, this is our supply after the tax, our equilibrium, and affected quantities. So if you were asked to find the amount of tax per unit on that good, you would just give them the value of like this black line right here, the height of that. If you were asked about the total tax revenue that the government got, you would multiply your tax right here by this new quantity. So you would basically find the area of this rectangle. And if you were asked to find the total expenditure, so that's basically everything that a consumer gets, you would do the new price, so the price after the tax times the quantity after the tax. So that's the total expenditure spent by consumers. And the total revenue that firms would actually receive would just be this rectangle right here. So firms are only receiving this much because this amount is being taken away by the tax. So now they're only receiving this much in price, and they're receiving this much of like quantity of goods being sold. So you would just do the new price that the firms receive, so this, and then multiplied by the new quantity. And is there anything else that I'm forgetting? Okay, yeah. So there's also the tax that's paid by consumers. I need to draw. Oh, there's colors. Okay. Anywho. Okay, so as I said before, this is the price that consumers are going to pay after the tax. I'll just call that PC, and then this is PF for the price that firms are going to pay after the tax. So to find what a consumer spends like in total taxes, like what amount of tax that a consumer bears the burden of, you would just do the equilibrium price. So you would do this distance, the distance between the price that consumers pay minus equilibrium price, and then multiplied by the new quantity. And then to find the amount of tax that a firm pays, so the burden of a tax that the firm carries, you would just do PE minus PF, so this distance multiplied by the new quantity that is like sold in the market after the tax. So there's a few things that you can be asked to identify on a graph. So it's useful to draw like the dotted lines and like figure it out from there. Is there anything that wasn't clear? Because I went kind of fast on that.
No, it actually all makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So it's like 10 o'clock almost. Any other last minute questions about Unit 1 or Unit 2? I didn't have anything prepared on Unit 2 for today, so that's why it's kind of like all over the place, but
It's fine. It all worked. It all worked. I'm good.
okay, cool. Okay, so I think we're done.
Okay, well, bye. Have a good day. Good night, I guess.
Bye. Thanks for coming.
You too.